In 1994, shortly after being released from prison and years before he ever ran for president, Hugo Chávez made his first visit to Cuba. On his lap was a large portrait of Simón Bolívar. It was a gift intended for Fidel Castro. Chávez expected he'd meet the Cuban leader during his trip, but he never expected that he'd personally welcome him on his arrival. Within minutes of landing in Havana, Castro himself was waiting for him on the runway. The two men embraced at the foot of the plane, and later that night they spoke for hours, through the night, until the sun rose the next morning. According to several accounts, the following day, when Castro's brother, Raúl Castro, asked him what he thought of the young Venezuelan rebel, Fidel said something like, "That man doesn't know the first thing about the Vietnam War or the Soviet Union, but he knows every town in Venezuela, every folklore story, the entire history of his country. He will become a great president one day." Castro was right. At the time, Chávez was not yet speaking like a communist. His ideology was built more around revolutionary nationalism, Simón Bolívar, the military, sovereignty, and redemption. Socialism and communism were surely appealing to him, but they were not yet the center of his public worldview. That would come later, because once president of Venezuela, with Fidel Castro's help, Hugo Chávez would become the face of a new brand of Latin American socialism.
Un socialismo del siglo XXI.
He called it Socialismo del siglo XXI, socialism of the 21st century.
¡Viva Venezuela! ¡Viva la revolución bolivariana!
President Chávez closed his 2006 presidential campaign with a spectacle at the heart of Caracas. The capital city's main arteries overflowed with red, the color of Chavismo. State television panned across the crowd from every angle. In the distance, supporters dissolved into a crimson horizon, an endless sea of red. Many had been there since dawn. Some had been bussed in from far-off cities for the chance to witness history. From rooftops and balconies, long banners unfurled, flags waved, and chants rolled through the streets. Chávez no se va. By then, the polls left little room for doubt. Chávez was far ahead of his opponent, Manuel Rosales, and the closing rally felt less like a final act of a competitive campaign than the coronation of a revolution. For more than 2 hours, Chávez spoke to the masses, but his speech was not really about Manuel Rosales, whom he dismissed as a mere lackey of the empire. It was about his true enemy, the United States of America.
No olvide nadie que nosotros estamos enfrentando al mismísimo diablo.
No one forget that we are confronting the devil himself.
El domingo 3 de diciembre enfrentaremos en las urnas electorales al gobierno imperialista de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica.
At the polls, we will confront the imperialist government of the United States of North America.
Ese es nuestro verdadero adversario.
That is our true adversary.
Vamos a derrotar al imperio más poderoso de la tierra el próximo domingo 3 de diciembre por nocaut.
On election day, we will defeat the most powerful empire on earth. He warned that the American empire would try to sabotage the vote. He portrayed the Venezuelan opposition as complicit oligarchs who had sold the country's interests to Washington.
Desde 1928 hasta 1998, la oligarquía encadenó a Venezuela.
From 1928 until 1998, the oligarchy had Venezuela in chains,
Y echó al pueblo a la miseria.
tying the people to misery.
Y los últimos 200 años, pues fuimos colonia norteamericana.
For 200 years, we were a colony of the North American Empire.
Venezuela comenzó a liberarse hace 8 años.
Only in the last 8 years have we become free. This was the emotional core of Chávez's campaign. Not an economic program, not a blueprint for Venezuela's future, not a theory of socialist transformation. The campaign was framed as a battle between the Venezuelan people and the American empire. And that's what makes what happened next so important. Because amid all of this fiery anti-imperialist rhetoric through his 2-hour speech, the word socialism barely appeared. Chávez spoke of empire, the oligarchy, the people, and the revolution. But socialism remained vague, hidden in the background. In fact, throughout the campaign, Chávez offered no clear blueprint for his so-called path towards socialism, no precise institutional model, no concrete explanation of what the socialist project would mean in practice. Then came election night.
Hugo Rafael Chávez Fría, 61.35%.
On December 3, 2006, Venezuela's electoral authorities announced that Hugo Chávez had been re-elected president. He had won with nearly 63% of the vote, defeating his opponent by more than a 25% point margin. From the balcony of Miraflores Palace, which Chavismo had dubbed the balcony of the people, Chávez appeared before his supporters and gave the victory a new meaning. This was not merely a vote for Chávez, he said. It was a vote for socialism.
Más del 60% de los venezolanos votó no por Chávez, sino por un proyecto que tiene nombre.
More than 60% of Venezuelans voted, not for Chávez, but for a project that has a name.
El socialismo venezolano.
Venezuelan socialism.
Socialismo bolivariano.
Bolivarian socialism.
Y esa es una de las más grandes victorias de hoy.
And that is one of the greatest victories from today.
Han demostrado un altísimo grado de conciencia política.
The people have demonstrated a very high level of political awareness
Y han votado por el socialismo del siglo XXI.
and have voted for socialism of the 21st century. And with that, the meaning of the election changed. The presidential campaign, framed almost entirely against the American empire, was transformed overnight into a mandate for socialism. But the truth was that Venezuelans had no idea what socialism of the 21st century actually meant. And Chávez did that on purpose. It was a political strategy. Because if the election had been about his socialist project, the result may have been different. So the phrase socialism had hovered at the margins of his campaign. Only now, after the votes had been counted, did it take center stage, recast by Chávez as the Venezuelan people's own decision to embark on a total transformation of society. The first time Chávez openly embraced socialism of the 21st century was in January 2005 in Porto Alegre, Brazil. He was speaking at the World Social Forum, an annual gathering created as a left-wing counterweight to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And there, before an audience of activists, intellectuals, and leftist movements, Chávez declared that the Bolivarian revolution had to move towards socialism.
Al capitalismo hay que trascenderlo por la vía del socialismo. Por esa vía es que hay que trascender el modelo capitalista.
But not the socialism of the Soviet Union. By 2005, the Soviet Union had been dead for more than a decade. Marxism, Leninism had collapsed as a global movement. Even many parties on the Latin American left had accepted some version of electoral democracy, market economics, or social democracy. So Chávez was not trying to revive old Soviet communism, at least not openly. He was trying to give socialism a new name, his name. But Chávez didn't invent the phrase socialism of the 21st century. The term was most closely associated with the German sociologist Heinz Dietrich, whose work called for a new socialist model beyond both capitalism and Soviet-style socialism. In theory, this new socialism was supposed to be democratic, gradual, and participatory. It emphasized referendums, economic planning, and the transformation of society through popular involvement rather than violent revolution. And that made it perfectly suited to Chávez. Because by this point, Chávez already had his own revolutionary mythology. Bolívar, the military, the people, resistance to empire. So socialism of the 21st century gave that mythology new ideological meaning. To the poor, it sounded like justice. To intellectuals, it sounded like a new kind of democracy. To anti-imperialists, it sounded like resistance. It fused Chávez's nationalism with the language of the Latin American left. It allowed him to present the Bolivarian Revolution not simply as a Venezuelan project, but as part of a continental struggle against imperialism, neoliberalism, and inequality. But the term remained vague. It became whatever Chávez wanted or needed it to become. Because once socialism meant everything, Chávez could use it to justify anything. Soon, the immense power of the Venezuelan state, its oil wealth, institutions, and military, would now be placed in service of a new mission, building a new society, a new state, unlike anything that had come before. After winning his re-election in 2006, Chávez wasted no time. Less than 2 weeks after the vote, he announced that his coalition of political parties would be merged into a single movement, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, el Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, or PSUV. With that, socialism was no longer just a slogan. It became the official language of the revolution. The creation of the PSUV centralized the many parties and movements of the Bolivarian coalition into a single political vehicle built around Chávez's personal leadership. It was not just a party, it was the ruling party, the institutional body of the revolution. Then, in January 2007, the Chavista-controlled National Assembly granted Chávez an 18-month enabling law, allowing him to rule by decree across broad areas of government, the economy, public administration, national defense, finance, and energy. The purpose of these powers, Chávez said, was to advance the country toward the consolidation of a socialist productive model. But centralizing the party and ruling by decree was not enough. Chávez wanted something deeper. He wanted to transform the state itself. And to do that, he would have to reform the same constitution that he himself had presented to the country in 1999. The democratic foundation of the Bolivarian Revolution. In 2007, Chávez unveiled a sweeping constitutional reform package designed to reforge Venezuela into a socialist republic. The proposal was massive. Chávez initially proposed changes to 33 articles. The National Assembly then expanded the package until it sought to modify 69 articles of the Constitution. Some of the changes were symbolic and broadly popular, lowering the voting age, reducing the work week, expanding Social Security, and reorganizing new forms of social property. Others were almost surreal. One proposal would have changed the official name of Caracas from Santiago de León de Caracas to Caracas, Bolívar's cradle and queen of the Guaraíra Repano, the indigenous name for the mountain range that most Caraqueños know as El Ávila. But beneath these symbolic and social reforms was a far more disturbing concentration of power. The reform would have abolished presidential term limits. It would have extended the presidential term from 6 to 7 years. It would have weakened central bank autonomy. It would have allowed the indefinite suspension of certain rights during states of emergency. It would have expanded state control over land, property, and the economy. And it would have given the president the power to create new territorial units, appoint regional vice presidents, and redraw the political map of the country from above. At the heart of the reform was a radical restructuring of the Venezuelan state. The old federal structure, states, municipalities, elected local authorities, would gradually be replaced by new communal institutions. Communal councils, communes, and other forms of popular power would become the basic units of political life. This was presented as participatory democracy, power moving closer to the people, Chávez claimed. But in practice, these new communal structures depended entirely on the central state. They were funded from above, reorganized from above, and integrated into a political project led by Chávez himself. That was the deeper meaning of the constitutional reform. Chávez was not simply proposing more social programs. He was trying to replace Venezuelan democracy with something new, built in his image. Representative institutions would be weakened. The presidency would become the engine of a new socialist state. The referendum was held on December 2nd, 2007. For the opposition, the reform revealed the unmistakable outline of a communist dictatorship. They campaigned relentlessly against it. The months leading up to the vote had already been marked by unrest. Earlier that year, the government had refused to renew the broadcast license of RCTV, Venezuela's oldest private television network and one of the most important opposition-aligned media outlets in the country.
No habrá nueva concesión para ese canal golpista de televisión que se llamó Radio Caracas Televisión.
That decision ignited protests and helped bring a new actor to the front of Venezuelan politics: university students. Young, articulate, and difficult to dismiss as an old, discredited opposition, the student movement became the face of resistance to the reform. They gave the No campaign a sense of energy and moral clarity that the traditional opposition had often lacked. Meanwhile, fears over private property resonated deeply with voters, including many poor Venezuelans who had benefited from Chávez's government, but didn't want the state to control their homes, land, or businesses. That fear transformed into the decisive factor. Traditional Chavista voters stayed home. Many didn't cross over to vote against Chávez. They simply abstained. But in a referendum this close, abstention was enough. In the end, voters narrowly rejected the reform by less than a single percentage point. It was Chávez's first and only electoral defeat. And it was the only time the Venezuelan people were asked directly whether they wanted to constitutionalize his socialism of the 21st century. The country had voted. It had said no.
Por ahora no pudimos. Por ahora no pudimos.
Por ahora no pudimos. For now, we were unsuccessful. That's what Chávez told the nation after losing the constitutional referendum, repeating the same phrase he had made famous after his failed coup attempt in 1992. But this time, there was no humility in defeat. He insisted.
Bueno, nosotros quiero que sepan que ni una sola coma de esta propuesta yo retiro.
I don't withdraw a single comma from this proposal.
Continúo haciendo la propuesta al pueblo venezolano. Esta propuesta sigue viva.
The socialist project, he made crystal clear, was not dead. True to his word, Chávez returned in 2009 with a new referendum to abolish term limits. This time, he won. And with that victory, the path to indefinite re-election was cleared. Then he turned to the National Assembly to enact the architecture of his new socialist state through a series of organic laws. But before we go any further, we need to pause for a moment. Because this is one of the clearest examples of the way Chávez repeatedly undermined the will of the very people he claimed to embody. His entire political mythology was built on the idea that he was the voice of the people, the poor, the excluded, the forgotten Venezuelans who were finally being heard. And yet, whenever the Venezuelan people acted in a way that limited his power, Chávez treated their decision as just another obstacle to be overcome. When Venezuelans signed the petition to activate the 2004 recall referendum, a constitutional mechanism that Chávez himself had included in the constitution, he turned those names into a weapon. The Tascón list was used to purge citizens from public institutions, public contracts, and social benefits. And now, when Venezuelans rejected his attempt to reform nearly 20% of the constitution in 2007, he straight up refused to accept defeat. He didn't say, "The people have spoken, and I will respect their decision." No. Instead, he told the country that he would continue anyway. For Chávez, the people were only sacred when they ratified his revolution. When they resisted it, they were mistaken, manipulated, standing in the way of history. That's why the claim that Chávez created a deeper, more inclusive democracy in Venezuela is just flat out wrong. He didn't deepen democracy. He destroyed it. He celebrated popular sovereignty when it empowered him, and overrode it whenever it constrained him. And now, after Venezuelans had rejected his constitutional project at the ballot box, Chávez set out to impose it entirely through ordinary legislation. This new state would be known as the Communal State, and in very simple terms, this is how it's supposed to work. Instead of organizing political life through mayors, governors, state legislatures, and a national parliament, the socialist state would be organized through communal institutions. Local communities would form communal councils. These communal councils would then elect representatives to communes. The communes would then elect representatives to communal cities. The communal cities would then be aggregated into communal federations, then communal confederations, culminating finally in a communal parliament. Together, these institutions would constitute the governing bodies of the future socialist republic. Now, if you just heard that and thought, that sounds crazy, you're right. It's absolutely insane. Not because community participation is bad. Of course, local communities should have a voice. The problem is that Chávez was not proposing neighborhood associations. He was envisioning an entirely new state. And the first obvious problem was accountability. In a normal democracy, you vote for a mayor. You vote for a governor. You vote for representatives in parliament. If they do a terrible job, you know who they are. You can organize against them. You can vote them out. But in a communal state, representation becomes indirect, layered, and almost impossible to trace. At every level, your voice gets more and more distant, more diluted, trapped in a labyrinth of endless committees and assemblies that ordinary people have no realistic way to monitor. And that brings us to the second problem, which is exhaustion. Because in this model, you're not simply a citizen anymore. You're expected to become a permanent political participant. Imagine living in a community where, if you want anything done, you yourself have to organize it. Fix the pipes, repair the road, build the park, attend meetings, mobilize your neighbors. That might sound empowering, but in reality it means that you're not allowed to just live your life. You still have to work, you have to raise your children, you have to study, cook, date, rest. But now, if you want basic services, the answer is organize through the commune. And the further up the system goes, the less represented you become. Because your community doesn't directly choose the people governing the entire system. Your communal council sends someone to the commune sends someone to the communal city, and so on until eventually someone far, far above you claims to speak in the name of the people. In your name. That's the trick. The system uses the language of direct democracy while creating a chain of indirect representation so long and so dense that accountability completely disappears. But in practice, the communal state never fully evolved beyond the level of communal councils and communes. There was no functioning national communal parliament replacing the National Assembly, no complete system of communal cities, federations, confederations governing the country. But the basis was there. Communal councils didn't begin after the constitutional referendum of 2007. They dated back to 2006, when they were presented as spaces of local participation and direct access to state funding. From the start, they were never politically neutral. They operated as pro-Chávez spaces, part campaign committees, part mechanisms for distributing resources through loyal political networks. In other words, it was a group of pro-Chávez citizens that received money from the state to fund local projects in their communities. And after Chávez lost the referendum, those structures became even more important. Because if Venezuela had rejected the communal state through constitutional reform, Chávez could still build it from below. In 2009, the organic law on communal councils made their ideological purpose explicit. Communal councils were now legally tied to the construction of, quote, the new model of socialist society. What had once been pitched as community governance was now formally absorbed into the revolutionary project. The councils were now linked to the Ministry of Popular Power. Their legal recognition, registration, and funding depended on the state already controlled by Chavismo. So the promise of local autonomy came with a condition. Communities could organize, but inside the ideological framework of the revolution. To borrow the infamous phrase from Fidel Castro, inside the revolution, everything. Outside the revolution, nothing. Then, in 2010, Chávez went further. The National Assembly passed a series of popular power laws, including the Organic Law of Communes and the Organic Law of the Federal Government Council. These laws gave legal form to the communal state. Communal councils could now be grouped into communes, and communes could be grouped into larger territorial units, and the state could create special development districts called Distrito Motores de Desarrollo, designed to organize territory according to the priorities of the socialist project. But here's the key point. The system looked decentralized, but real power still flowed from above. The communal councils depended on the state, on Chávez, for absolutely everything. They depended on the state for funding. They depended on ministries, presidential commissions, and institutions controlled by the ruling party. And these so-called development districts were headed by authorities designated by Chávez. So the atomized power of the communal councils and communes was no match for the centralized authority of the president. Whatever the president said goes. That's why the communal state was so dangerous. If Chavismo lost a municipality, power could be redirected to the communal councils. If opposition mayors won elections, resources could bypass them to the communes. If governors became inconvenient, authority could be shifted into parallel institutions. The formal republic would remain on paper, while real power moved into structures controlled by Chávez, by the revolution. In that sense, Venezuela's communal state echoed earlier socialist experiments. The Soviet Union also began with a language of councils. That's what the word Soviet means. But those councils were quickly subordinated to the Communist Party and became the scaffolding of a single-party state. Venezuela didn't reproduce that model exactly, but the logic was very similar. Institutions presented as popular self-government were absorbed into a centralized revolutionary project, which answered to one man, and one man only: Hugo Chávez. But Chávez's socialist project was about much more than the communal state. As he built the political infrastructure of his socialism of the 21st century, he also turned towards something even more radical: the transformation of the Venezuelan economy itself. Price controls, expropriations, experiments in collective ownership. The revolution would now enter farms, factories, supermarkets, and private businesses across the country. Venezuelans were not just about to witness the blueprint for a new political order. They were about to live through an experiment that would tear through the foundations of society. And the consequences would be catastrophic.